мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Today at 1, we're live in Ukraine as Russia invades in a major military assault by land, sea and air.
It's now more than a month since the US Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. China's ambassador to Australia also issued a blunt warning a few days ago that those who push for Taiwanese independence will be punished.
We're waiting for a peaceful reunification, but we cannot rule out other options.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore.
This is why we fight. Democracy is at war. Across the world, we see the forces rallied against it. From the authoritarian regimes of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to techno-aristocrats, religious fundamentalists, and populist demagogues. In the battlefields of Ukraine to the Straits of Taiwan and the halls of power in the United States, democratic, free values are under determined assault. But there are those who resist. They are activists, journalists, academics, soldiers, religious leaders, and politicians. In this series, we will meet those who claim to be fighting for a free world. We will find out who they are, how they're involved in the struggle, what democracy means to them, and why it's worth fighting for. Hello and welcome to this episode of Why We Fight. Today I am speaking with Jimmy Rushton, a defense analyst and freelance journalist here in Kyiv. We are recording outside because there's an enormous amount of construction going on inside. So if you hear any background noise from cars and such, I do apologise. Anyway, Jimmy, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, what is it that you do exactly?
So, I moved out to Kyiv in May 2022. Been here pretty much non-stop since then. And I'm a freelance journalist and analyst. So, I write about Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and associated subjects for a variety of publications, including The Telegraph, New Lines Magazine, Yahoo News, and others.
How long have you been doing this, and where have you gone?
So I've been an analyst for longer than I've been a journalist for. I was doing a bunch of work for private clients before I became a journalist and before I was writing, public-facing stuff. And in Ukraine, I've been pretty much everywhere, every region of Ukraine apart from Crimea. I've also been into Russia with the Ukrainian military intelligence. I went to Sudzha in October 2024. But yeah, I've done a bunch of frontline reporting. I've also done a lot of reporting from Kyiv and other, cities in Ukraine.
And you've been to other countries as well?
Sure, yeah, I've spent some time in Iraq, been to Lebanon, been to a bunch of other countries that, not typical tourist destinations.
So, you've had a long career, you've been all over the world reporting as a journalist and doing this private stuff as a defense analyst. So you've got your finger on the pulse with what's going on in the security world, I would say.
I would say so. I mean, recently I've been kind of hyper-focused on Ukraine, obviously, but obviously the security environment in the UK is something I keep close tabs on. I still have a lot of contacts in that world, and yeah, I try to, because so many of the security challenges that we face are interconnected, from terrorism to migration to direct military threats from states like Russia and China. So it's very much interconnected.
How have you seen the world change, the state of the world change over the course of your career?
I mean, it's definitely gotten more dangerous. I think we've seen some of the post-war norms break down. We've seen the accepted use of force to redraw borders. We've seen that with Armenia, Azerbaijan. We've seen that obviously in Ukraine. We've seen that in I think we're seeing that in Israel-Palestine now. It does seem like we're entering a far more dangerous world. Obviously, we had two nuclear powers, engaging in direct confrontation, Pakistan and India, very, very recently, and that could have gone quite badly, quite quickly, I think. So I do think in that one case, you do need to give credit to the American Trump administration for actually negotiating a ceasefire, because it did look like that situation was spiraling out of control. And we do see this an age of insecurity, I would say, where you have a kind of a might makes right view of the world, and you have countries that have, more military strength bullying countries that don't have as much military strength. Again, coming back to Azerbaijan and Armenia, we clearly saw that there. Regardless of in terms of international law, which country was in the right, because obviously Nagorno-Karabakh was technically Azerbaijani territory, but there was a sizable Armenian majority living there. So it's a difficult situation, but at the same time, it's a situation that would have traditionally been negotiated. The outcome would have been negotiated; it wouldn't have been decided by the use of military force. And I think that's why it's so dangerous now. We're living in this world where might makes right. The weak must suffer what they must. And yeah, it's not a good world to be living in, I don't think.
You're in Ukraine at the moment. Why did you come here initially?
So I came here in May 2022, and I originally came out with my friend and co-writer Michael Weiss. We were initially just going to spend a couple of weeks out here. I decided to stay, partly because in order really to understand any conflict, ongoing conflict, I think you need to immerse yourself in it. I think you need to be on the ground. I think you can have a good understanding from a distance, but I don't think it compares to living the conflict, speaking to people, participating in it every day. And obviously I've been here for a long time now, and I've experienced life in Kyiv as any other Ukrainian would have. I've been through the air raids and the power cuts, and so I think that gives you a sense of at least understanding to a better level what Ukrainians have been through.
To some in the West who may not understand, why is this war so important?
I mean, just you can look at it in simple terms that this is the biggest land war since the end of the Second World War, and it's taking place in Europe. We've seen, again, the borders of Europe being redrawn by the use of arms. And, that's an incredibly dangerous precedent to set. It's also absolutely the case that Russia is a dangerous expansionist, imperialistic power. And, when countries like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania and Poland to a lesser degree believe the Russians aren't going to stop in Ukraine and tell everyone that with a very, very loud voice, I think we should listen, because they generally have a better understanding of the Russians than Western European countries do, because they've had centuries of dealing with Russian imperialism, and the scars of that imperialism are still very, very real in these countries. So I think it's important just from a practical level. I think it's also important from a moral level that you shouldn't permit a large imperialistic genocidal country to bully and subjugate a small or smaller independent country that really wants to just live free of that imperialism, that centuries old Russian imperialism which has blighted Ukrainian history for so long.
You've been to Russia. What did you find there? That is...
Yeah, I mean, I went to Russia with the Ukrainian military, and the interesting thing is when I went there, it wasn't as dangerous as it became, because the road into Sudzha became incredibly dangerous. It was targeted extensively by Russian FPVs, some of their best drone units, artillery, Lancets, etc. But what I found was a town which was largely intact. Apartments that had been, forcibly entered because the Ukrainians needed to check that, there weren't any Russian soldiers hiding there. But the interesting thing was that the apartments were completely unlooted. I remember going into one apartment just off the centre of Sudzha, and all the appliances were there. There were valuables just, on the shelves. It's a complete contrast to how the Russian soldiers behaved when they captured Ukrainian settlements, and they carted off everything that they could move: washing machines, cookers, microwaves, etc. But yeah, no, from what I saw, the Ukrainians were, there was no looting. They had taken care of the remaining population to best their ability. There wasn't that many people there when I was there. Most of the Russian civilians had evacuated. But yeah, no, it was a very interesting experience. I think what strikes you as well when you go into, say, it's the apartment that I went, or at least one of the apartments that I went into, it was clearly inhabited by quite an old and sick person, because there was pictures of like USSR era festivities on the wall, and there was hypodermic needles with medication there. So that person had clearly, they weren't living a great life. And it's just incredible the amount of expense that Russia has spent killing Ukrainians, right? And the amount of good that they could have done for their own people with the amount that they've spent on this ridiculous, completely pointless war. And this is a war that's not just had impacts for Ukrainians; it's had massive impacts for Russians as well. And I think when people talk about the impact on Ukraine, they always talk about fighting to the last Ukrainian, all these kind of tired Russian propaganda tropes. But they don't really talk about the what Putin is doing to Russians. And stopping this war, helping Ukraine win this war quicker, has a massive impact on Russians as well, because if you're worried about humanitarian impact, as a lot of people that are critical of Ukraine claim they are, Russians are suffering from Putin's rule as much as not as much, but to a large degree. And yeah, it's just a kind of how unnecessary this whole thing was, because this is like one of the from the Russian perspective, this is one of the most unnecessary wars that's ever been launched, right? Ukraine did not pose a threat to Russia in any sense. This is really about the Russian desire to subjugate Ukraine. It's about the Russian desire to regain, their empire, the traditional Russian empire. And again, it's incredibly unnecessary. And I think you really see that when you go into Russia and you see, that this war's come home to Russians. It absolutely has. It's not just the Ukrainian occupation of Sudzha. It's also the drone strikes. The Ukrainian drone program is incredibly capable now. And yeah, the idea that this war would be over quickly and would have no cost for the Russians is clearly not the case.
And you're seeing conscription police on the streets of Russian cities. I understand there's recently been a significant public order event, I can't recall exactly where, led by a farmer in Russia against conscription efforts. So it does seem to be striking home. What would you say to those who are echoing the Russian narrative that this also comes down to the expansion of NATO?
Well, it's just nonsense. NATO is not a threat to Russia, and Russia completely understands that. What NATO is a threat to is Russian ambitions to impose their will on their neighbours, right? And they completely understand that once a country becomes part of NATO and the EU to a lesser extent, it can't be bullied anymore. Or if they try to bully it, their efforts are going to be significantly less successful. So no, it's not about NATO. It's always been about the Russian desire to impose essentially Russian control over countries that they view as being in their sphere of interest.
We're seeing democratic backsliding in the United States. Donald Trump is consistently skeptical, to put it lightly, of continued support to Ukraine. It's a distinct possibility that he pulls support, as he did before the Russian counteroffensive in Kursk. What should Europe be doing now?
So yeah, I mean, to be clear, in regards to the American withdrawal of support, it wasn't really connected with the Russian offensive in Kursk. At that point, they'd already brought the main logistics route into Sudzha under fire control. The writing was on the wall there for weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. The Ukrainians really stayed too long in Sudzha. They should have pulled out a couple of weeks before they did. So in that regard, look, I don't know if Trump's going to pull military aid. I don't know if anyone knows that he's going to do that. I think even he doesn't know what he's going to do on a day-to-day basis, because he's a creature of reaction and kind of pure id. He's incredibly transactional, and it seems at the moment that the Ukrainian government, they've been playing him quite well. They've done this minerals deal, which really doesn't give that much away, but has seemed to have given him something that he can point at and show off to his base. I think in regards to, you're not going to see another aid package pass Congress, but I think what you might see is what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. We've seen foreign military sales, we've seen transfers of weapons from other countries, and again, US weapons need American consent to be transferred to a third party, and the Germans have sent Patriot missile interceptors, they've sent GMLRS. We've seen today the Australians are sending their Abrams tanks.
And 2 days ago, the Italians with M113s,
exactly. So, look, if the Ukrainian strategy of keeping the American government at least engaged, and the other part of that strategy is keeping them aligned to the greatest extent possible with their European allies, who are seen to be closer to their position than the Americans are at the moment. So that is working, and I don't think you should underestimate the importance of even this one transfer of Patriot missile interceptors, because 100 Patriot missile interceptors is a lot of cruise missiles or ballistic missiles that get shot down. It's a lot of Ukrainian lives that could be saved by this. So yeah, Trump is unpredictable, mercurial. He's not someone that's driven by morality. He's incredibly transactional, but he is also able to be manipulated, and the Ukrainians know this, and I think they've been smart in the way they've been showing themselves to be open to American overtures in regards to peace. They've taken every opportunity to agree to American proposals in regards to ceasefires. Zelensky obviously turned up in Istanbul, Putin did not.
But then, a couple of days afterwards, when asked about who is blocking peace, Trump immediately references Zelensky. Do you think you said he's able to be manipulated? Are you not concerned that Putin is able to manipulate him more effectively?
Of course. I mean, I think the thing is with Putin and Trump really don't speak that often, and obviously you could argue that Putin's actions manipulate Trump to an extent, yes, but Trump also speaks to European leaders, and he has a decent relationship with many European leaders. He likes Keir Starmer, he quite likes Macron, he likes Meloni, and these people do have influence. A lot of people say, "Oh no, Europeans have no influence with Trump," but that's just not true. He does. I mean, he especially likes the UK. He really does.
Coming back to Europe, given Trump's mercurial nature, and transactional nature, what else should Europe be doing to assist here in Ukraine?
Well, so one of the big things I think that Europe can do, because Europe is rich, is help supply Ukraine with, financial resources to boost Ukrainian domestic weapons production, because at the moment Ukrainians are producing between 40 to 50% of all their material needs themselves. We can also purchase large quantities of commercially available drone components and drones on the open market. Stuff like DJI Mavics, FPV drones, etc. That stuff can be relatively easily sourced, and it can be sourced quickly because it's commercially available. And despite the fact it's commercially available, it still has a massive impact. Almost every Ukrainian military unit uses DJI Mavics for battlefield observation. So they are incredibly important. So that's absolutely something we can do. We also need to be rebuilding our domestic defence industrial capability, because we've let it atrophy to a large extent. And there is tentative progress with this, like Rheinmetall are building massive amounts of ordnance production capability. They're going to be able to produce something like 2 million shells by 2027, something like in that region. In the UK, we're seeing Sheffield Forge Masters now building artillery barrels for the M777, another 155mm howitzers. So, you know, we are seeing this happen, but it needs to happen quicker. We also need to be bringing on production of, you know, long-range PGMs like Storm Shadow. We need to be building those, and as far as I'm aware, the production lines on those types of munitions haven't really been restarted, which I think is a missed opportunity. But there might be technical constraints that the actual production capabilities just might not be available at the moment.
Most basic drone parts, drones being an absolutely essential part of this war, although Ukraine, I believe, manufactures 80% of its own drones. Most drone parts come from the People's Republic of China, which has maintained outward neutrality but aligns more closely and has announced a strategic alignment on May 9th or May 8th, I can't remember which day, with Vladimir Putin. Are you concerned that they may recognize drone components as strategic resources and cut off the supply to the West?
No, they won't do that, because if they did that, that would kill DJI. So for them, you know, DJI is the world leader in consumer drones, and it's a very valuable company. It has a lot of benefits to the Chinese. You know, that position has a lot of benefits to the Chinese. So no, they won't do that, because again, that would kill off the Chinese drone industry. It's possible they might try and restrict sales of FPV components to, you know, entities which are specifically buying them for Ukraine, but even that would be difficult, and I don't think they do that. The Chinese are quite pragmatic, and yeah, they are allied with the Russians, but at the same time, they don't want to risk secondary sanctions from the US. They don't want to risk the EU putting more constraints on Chinese technology. They're actually quite happy for the Russians to bleed themselves out in Ukraine, because the weaker Russia gets, the more dominant China is in that relationship. They are, you know, they're smart. The Chinese have always been smart, and I think people underestimate them at their peril.
This war is often, you know, couched in the terms of democracy. Ukrainians are defending their democracy, they're defending their freedom. This war, in many ways, is a war between a dictator and democrats. What are the other main threats to democracy globally in your eyes?
I mean, it very much depends and differs country by country, but I think the wider threats are from disinformation, from really, like, you see, especially, for example, in America, Republicans and Democrats essentially can't even agree on basic facts at this point. And how does democracy work when, you know, two groups of people look at the sky and say, well, no, it's blue, and one group says it's green? You know, I think the other thing is democracies are extremely vulnerable to disinformation and to information operations in a way that totalitarian or authoritarian states are not. So there's an imbalance in that regard. I do think that, you know, climate change, migration, they all are challenges to democratic societies, because as climate change destabilizes countries, you have more migration. You see migration fueling the rise of far right and far left, in some cases, parties in Europe. And I do think that there is a kind of, you know, I call myself a liberal myself, but I think there is a liberal delusion when it comes to immigration, that if we just explain it slightly better, people will agree with us. And it's just like, that's not going to happen. It's essentially, and I think the Labour government have understood this now, that you either get to grips with immigration, or you get a reform government or something similar to a reform government that under the Tories. So I think it's difficult, because there's so many threats to democracy at the moment, and it's difficult to know exactly which one to focus on, because there are so many.
I want to move on to your values and sort of what drives you to be here. But what does freedom mean to you?
I mean, it's quite abstract, really, because essentially freedom, you could think of many definitions of freedom, right? Freedom from boredom, freedom from hunger, freedom from material want. But fundamentally, in this case, it is very real, right? It's the freedom to walk down the street in a Ukrainian city without getting shot at by the Russians, or killed by the Russians, or picked up by the Russians because you're speaking Ukrainian. So it is very much a real sense that if these people aren't defended, if the West doesn't step up, and if we can't support them, their way of life, and that does sound very corny, but literally their way of life just disappears. And you can see this in occupied territories where Ukrainians are being picked up and tortured for speaking Ukrainian. And essentially it's about the freedom of people to decide their own political destiny. That this all started back, okay, you could go back to centuries of Russian oppression, but this is the modern kind of, or this current incarnation of this conflict started in Maidan, where peaceful protesters were brutally attacked by the regime-controlled police, and really that's really what started this off, right? It's people were protesting, Russian-aligned security forces attacked them, and here we are. I think for the Ukrainians, it's very easy for people in the West to not really understand what an existential conflict is, because in the British popular memory, we had an existential conflict in the Second World War, but we still really don't understand how that feels now, because our understanding of conflict, our understanding of war has been coloured by decades of the war on terror and counterinsurgency and wars of choice. We've always had the ability to disengage from these conflicts at will. But again, for Ukrainians, you fight or you die, really, and it's as simple as that. You fight or your culture dies, you fight or your language dies, you fight, or your family dies. So yeah, it's freedom from all of that, really.
I want to ask a quick follow-up. Ukraine is under martial law because, as you said, it's in an existential fight. I would argue it's on the death ground that Sun Tzu describes, where your enemy must fight or die, or where they must fight or die. Martial law brings with it a number of things. There's a curfew here in Kyiv at midnight. There are checkpoints. There is also conscription of, I believe it's men between the age of 25 and somewhere around
60, 61.
Yeah. Now, conscription is often used by, or pointed to by, actors and journalists, etc., in the West, who say that Ukraine is not a real democracy. What do you have to say to that?
It's nonsense. Democracies have always had conscription during war. We had conscription in the First World War, Second World War. It's just stupid. It just displays the fundamental misunderstanding of what conflict is about how a society exists during a war. I to be honest, I don't really think it deserves any lengthier answer than that. It's just complete nonsense by people that don't know what they're talking about.
You know what that will do as an answer. And another follow-up about Maidan, and this is again probably going to be a brief answer. Those who say it was a coup d'etat, one actor who likes to call it a journalist who likes to call it a putsch, and that it was backed by the West. This is the Russian narrative. What would you say to counter that?
I know which journalist you're talking about, and he's a moron. It's look, if you can look at the history of Maidan. Essentially, and we touched upon this briefly before, it was protesters peacefully protesting the blocking of the passage of a bill which was overwhelmingly supported by the Rada, which was overwhelmingly supported by the Ukrainian population. And initially, these people were not seeking the overthrow of the government or the downfall of the government. They were just, they were expressing their dissatisfaction with his decision, which is entirely democratically legitimate. What happened then was, instead of just, effectively ignoring these people or tolerating the protest, they tried to stifle and break up the protest using, disproportionate extreme force. And I think any government that starts murdering its own citizens, disappearing its own citizens, which essentially is what happened, loses any form of legitimacy. And it's just incredibly stupid. But then everything this particular reporter, I don't want to call him a reporter, he's a blogger, and he's someone who, a professional contrarian, who really doesn't know anything about any of the subjects he talks about. He was exactly the same on Syria, got basic facts wrong. It's ludicrous. It's not supported by any evidence. It's professional contrarianism at its best, and it's outright stupidity at its worst.
About democracy and that right to protest, that right to disagree, that right to say, as I like to say, it's the right to say F you. What is the value in it to you?
Look, I think everyone having the ability to protest and freely associate, etc., is the cornerstone of a democratic society. It doesn't mean that protesters always have to be listened to, because you don't have a right to be, for your point to be actioned by a democratically elected government, but you do have a right to freely state your view without being tortured, beaten, disappeared by the police. And I think that's a cornerstone of a democratic society.
We're seeing democratic backsliding in a lot of countries, but we see polling numbers, especially among young people in the UK, poll pretty badly for democracy, and poll badly for when asked the question, would you fight to defend the UK if it were attacked by an enemy? And what would you say to those back home who no longer value democracy?
I think in regards to the polling question, I think at the moment it's too abstract. So I think if there was actually a threat, similar to what we faced in Second World War, I think people would be willing to fight. But at the moment, the threat is too abstract, and we have nuclear weapons. So people are like, well, what? Nobody's going to threaten us. So, stupid question. I'm not going to fight for my country because I don't need to fight for my country, because we have a volunteer military, we have nuclear weapons, we're part of NATO. So I do think there is a problem with young people's support for democracy. I think that's partly because if you look at the UK, there definitely is a sense of decline, and there's a sense of successive governments not really doing anything about it. There's definitely a sense of, some people feel betrayal. This is partly because the idiots that led us into Brexit promised, obviously, that it would lead to lesser immigration, and it hasn't. If anything, immigration has increased, and also immigration has increased from countries where, instead of European countries where people would be temporary immigrants, where they would come and then go home, we've seen immigration rise from, say, Sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria and India. So we've seen, and those people generally stay in the UK, they don't leave, unlike, say, Poles, Latvians, Lithuanians, etc. And I think, for people that are concerned about immigration, and if you look at reform, one of the biggest drivers for reform support is concern about immigration. I think they feel betrayed because they were told that voting for Brexit, they were lied to by the people that sold them Brexit by saying this would cut immigration, and it didn't. It also didn't increase our economic growth. It didn't result in 350 million extra for the NHS or whatever Boris wrote on his stupid bus. And I think, if you're a young person in the UK, it's not a particularly good, you don't have great prospects, right? You go to university, you rack up £50,000 worth of debt, which is charged on interest rates that mean you'll never pay it back. You won't be able to afford a house, almost certainly. People wonder why young people are kind of losing faith in democracy, and then you look at the kind of challenges that young people are facing at the moment, and it's kind of obvious, right? It should be pretty clear. Governments need to do better. They need to do better for young people. They need to do better for everyone, to be honest. the standard of governance in the UK has been incredibly poor for a long time. The Labour government have done some things right, some things wrong. There do seem to be some, economic growth in the UK does seem to be doing much better recently, which is obviously welcome news. But I do think that there needs to be reform in a lot of Western countries, and they need to give their citizens better prospects. They need to, especially young people, because if young people don't feel they have a stake in society, they will A, not want to defend it, B, turn to people that are offering populist, extremist solutions to problems that they see in society.
So would you say we've lost in the democratic West our respect for positive freedoms? That's the freedom to buy a house, the freedom to go to the doctor, the freedom to get a good job, and the freedom to see your children grow up to be more successful than you.
To an extent, yeah. I mean, again, people would always want their kids to, to be more successful, to be more prosperous than they are. I mean, if you look at declining birth rates in the West, people are putting off having kids because they just can't afford it. And who can blame them? Like, if you're living, even if you're well paid, you're living in a relatively small flat in London, you're not going to have kids because there's no space to have kids. And so much of the prosperity has been concentrated in London and other big cities, where living space is at premium because governments have just neglected to build houses. Successive governments have neglected to build houses. Look at infrastructure. Successive governments have neglected to build infrastructure. And when they do build it, it's insanely overpriced and takes, like HS2, I think the latest date is 2038 or something ridiculous like that. There's this kind of general malaise in the UK and other Western societies, although particularly in the UK, where governments, there's no ambition, there's no sense of what we want our country to look like. It's really very managerial. It's very managing day-to-day decline almost. And every person that I speak to from London, everyone that I know has had their phone stolen or knows someone that's had their phone stolen. The feeling that crime is essentially, like low-level crime has been decriminalised, is pervasive, and it's just, again, it feeds into this atmosphere where people feel despondent, people feel society's going the wrong direction, and they will look for extreme alternatives to the mainstream parties if mainstream parties have been viewed to have failed over and over again.
Which ironically may only hurt them more, as we see in Hungary, as we see in Slovakia, as we're beginning to see in the United States. Yeah, absolutely. Like, the populist solutions never really work. I mean, Brexit didn't work. Brexit made immigration worse, and it made people poorer. But again, this is the problem. It's like immigration. You can't really trying to persuade people that this is bad for them often doesn't work, because the more and there've been some interesting studies done on this in regards to like correcting misinformation, but the more you try and persuade people, the more they kind of retrench in their views. So really what the mainstream parties need to do is they need to stop trying to talk to people and act, right? Grow people's prosperity, control immigration, build houses, because once people have a well-paid job, they have a house they can live in, they can have kids or whatever, they have access to good healthcare, they're not going to be so dissatisfied, they're not going to think they have to go to extreme lengths in order to remedy the perceived wrongs in their society.
Yeah, what I always think is indicative of this is that when The Simpsons started in, I think, 1986, they were clearly, it was meant to be a poor-ish, lower middle class family. And now the way of life The Simpsons has is absolutely beyond what most people can aspire to. The Simpsons is now aspirational, and that paints a picture of loss to me. But do you have hope?
Yeah, so look, I think fundamentally most people are generally ultimately good, or at least have good intentions, and I do think the British people generally pretty good, pretty tolerant. I think in Ukraine, I definitely think this country will survive. I think it will win in the sense that it will continue to be an independent country. Ukrainians will still obviously try to regain the occupied territories, and I think ultimately they will succeed, but I think it will take a long time to get the occupied territories back. It will always mean more to the Ukrainians than it will to the Russians. And they will not stop fighting to get these territories back, whether that ultimately becomes a diplomatic fight, a kind of a grey zone fight where it moves into the, shadow operations, espionage, etc. after, open hostilities have ended. But I'm hopeful for the Ukrainian people. Like, Ukrainian people are very resilient, very smart. This is a country of engineers. Just look at, for example, the Ukrainian drone program, which basically went from nothing to more sophisticated and more capable than the Russian drone program in 2.5 years. So yeah, no, I have hope. But I also think that people should not underestimate the challenges that face us, both in Ukraine and in the West, because I think people have been far too complacent for far too long. And I think for Ukraine, in regards to what we can do, and we can have a massive impact on the outcome of this war, because even if our support won't be the difference between, say, victory and defeat, all the military aid that we supply to Ukraine ultimately saves Ukrainian lives, because it means that Ukraine can resist with fewer casualties. So it really is a case of the more we can send them, the more funding we can send them to procure Ukrainian weapons, the more weapons we can directly send, the more Ukrainians come out of this war alive, and the more successful post-war Ukraine can become.
You deal with quite a lot of heavy things. You go to the front. You live here in Kyiv. We all deal with the air alert. And what do you do to relax? There's a bit of a fluffy question towards the end.
I don't really relax, to be honest. I don't really feel the stress that much. I think so. I kind of made peace with any level of personal risk when I came here. From my perspective, once you accept the risk, there's no point worrying about it. That doesn't mean I'm not security conscious, because I absolutely am. But I'm a journalist as well as an analyst. When there's an air raid, I don't go to shelters. I observe what's happening, because I think it's important that people do. And on a pragmatic level, you have to look at risk, relative risk. Relative risk of getting killed in a Russian air raid in Kyiv specifically is far less than I think would be the risk of becoming a victim of violent crime in, say, a South American city. And statistically, you're probably more likely to get killed crossing the road than you are in a hostile action of the Russians here. So from my personal perspective, yeah, I don't really feel it. But for Ukrainians, it's obviously it's terrifying, and it's something that I wouldn't wish on anyone, really. It's having to live with that kind of constant insecurity is really not pleasant. Yeah.
If not relax, what do you do to have fun?
I go to the gym. I used to be a DJ years ago, so I still DJ from now and then. I like music, I like films, but this life is kind of all-consuming, really. You live, eat, sleep, breathe, work, and yeah, like, I haven't really had a holiday for years. I mean, I've been to the Carpathians briefly, but I had to work when I was there. So, but it's the life that I chose, and I'm happy doing it, because I think the most important thing for me is that I feel that I can help in whatever way that I can. I know that some of my reporting and some of my analysis has had an impact, and ultimately it's never boring. It's a lot of things, but it's not boring.
Just to close out, if any of my listeners want to help either defend democracy in the UK or help Ukraine in its fight against Russian imperialism, what's your advice to them?
I mean, it very much depends on what their capabilities are. You can donate to the Ukrainian military, NGOs, you can get involved with activism, you can lobby people, or if you have military experience, you can come and join the Ukrainian military. There are a lot of British people in Kyiv, astonishing amount actually of British veterans that serve very proudly in the Ukrainian military. In fact, we lost a friend of mine, Chris Garrett, better known as Swampy. He was EOD and he was working with his team around Izium a couple of weeks ago, and he was killed. But he did a lot of good here. It's really dependent on your skills and what you want to do and what you're capable of doing. And to be honest, just talking about Ukraine and supporting Ukrainian organisations, amplifying Ukrainian voices, amplifying reporting about Ukraine is as much as most people can or should do, to be honest, because you shouldn't get involved with direct military action unless you've got military experience and you know exactly what you're doing. But yeah.
Jimmy, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for coming on.
No problem.
This has been Why We Fight. If you enjoyed the program, please consider subscribing to this show or financially supporting my work by following the Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee links below. For my written work and commentary, then check out my Substack, Dictators v Democrats. If you want to join a community of those who believe that democracy is worth fighting for, then feel free to join the Dictators v Democrats Discord server, which is also linked below. And remember, democracy is non-negotiable.